The rain had not stopped for 3 days, and the earth of Vermilion Parish had turned to a thick, sucking mud that swallowed footsteps whole. The crows perched along the telephone lines, dead lines that hadn't carried a signal in 20 years, watching the old shack in silence. It stood at the edge of the swamp like a wound that refused to heal, its roof sagging beneath the weight of moss and memory. Locals swore no one had lived there since 1957, but when the wind shifted, they claimed they could still smell kerosene and milk, the faint scent of a home once alive. Inside, everything was preserved as if time itself had turned away in disgust. 2 plates on the table, a wedding photograph half-burnt at the edges, and a child's rattle resting near a cradle that had long gone empty. They said the couple who built this house had come from nowhere. Martha was quiet, her eyes soft but haunted, and Eli carried himself with the tired strength of a man born to work and worry. They met by accident, or so the town believed, a twist of fate at a harvest gathering that no one could remember clearly afterward. But when they stood together, people whispered that there was something unsettling about them, something too similar in the way their faces tilted, in the way they both squinted against the sun as if sharing the same memory. When their child was born, the doctor fled the house without saying a word. The midwife who remained refused to speak for the rest of her life. And within days, the young couple vanished into the woods behind their home, swallowed by the same darkness that had always watched them. Now, nearly 70 years later, the swamp still keeps its secret. But sometimes, when the fog drifts low and the trees begin to whisper, travelers hear it, a faint cry from somewhere deep in the cypress. Too soft to be a scream. Too human to be the wind. In the forgotten stretch of Louisiana's swamp country, far from paved roads and church bells, lay an isolated settlement known only to those born within it. The air there was heavy with humidity and the scent of decaying cypress, a place where the sun seldom pierced through the tangled canopy of moss that hung like ghostly curtains over the marsh. The people of this settlement lived as though time had stopped around them. They built their homes from rotting timber, relied on rainwater and river fish, and treated strangers as omens. Electricity never reached them, and the outside world regarded them as little more than a rumor whispered between truckers who passed through the nearby highway. To its residents, the swamp was not just home, it was protection, a natural barrier that kept the curious out and the truth buried beneath layers of mud and memory. Generations had lived and died there without leaving behind any written record. Births were remembered by the color of the moon, deaths marked by carvings on tree trunks. No government official ever visited, no census counted them, and no preacher dared to set foot in their chapel since the last one vanished one summer night decades ago. The people were wary of light, of mirrors, and most of all, of questions. They believed the land itself punished curiosity, that the swamp would reclaim anyone who pried too deeply into what lay beyond the waterline. Yet even among them, whispers persisted, old wives' tales of families who intermarried for so long that bloodlines twisted back upon themselves like the roots of the mangroves. It was in this forgotten cradle of silence that the story began, long before anyone knew its name. The isolation of the settlement did more than shape the people's lives, it shaped their minds, teaching them to trust only what they could see and to forget everything else. Roads that once led out had been swallowed by the swamp, and with them, the memory of connection to the rest of the world. Those born there never questioned where they came from or who they were, because their elders never spoke of it. In that void of history and identity, an entire generation grew up believing they were the first, as if the land itself had birthed them. It was this eerie disconnection from the past that would later allow 2 souls, bound by blood and tragedy, to meet without recognizing the echo of themselves in each other's eyes. It was during one of the rare gatherings that brought the people of the swamp together that Martha and Eli first met. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and roasted corn, and the flicker of lanterns cast uneven shadows across the clearing. The annual harvest gathering was not so much a celebration as a ritual of survival, an evening to mark the end of another season without sickness or flood. The settlement's people arrived in silence, carrying baskets of dried fish, fruit, and homebrewed spirits, speaking only in low tones that disappeared into the murmur of the swamp. Among them stood Eli, tall and lean, his face hardened by labor and years of humidity. His hands were the kind that carried the story of work, scarred, strong, and still. Martha was quieter than most, her eyes downcast as if afraid to meet anyone's gaze for too long. Yet when their paths crossed, something imperceptible stirred between them, something that neither could name but both instantly felt. There was a strange familiarity in their meeting, a recognition that didn't belong to memory but to something older, something buried in the marrow. When Martha first looked at Eli, she hesitated, not from fear, but confusion. His eyes, the pale gray of a storm waiting to break, mirrored her own in a way that unsettled her. He felt it too, though he didn't show it. Their conversation began with awkward politeness, small remarks about the weather and the thinning crop, but it carried a quiet intensity that lingered even after words had run out. When the music began, a single fiddle playing a tune older than anyone remembered, they danced. It wasn't graceful, but it was honest, and for a fleeting moment, they looked less like strangers and more like two halves of a forgotten whole finding each other again. The older villagers watched them with uneasy curiosity. Some turned away, whispering to themselves. Others stared, unable to understand the strange connection forming before their eyes. One woman in particular, the midwife who had delivered nearly every child in the settlement, froze when she saw them together. She knew the faces of their families, though neither of them knew their families' names. Something about their resemblance struck her cold, but fear tied her tongue. In this place, truth was more dangerous than sin, and silence was its only form of mercy. As the night waned and the swamp swallowed the last of the lantern light, Martha and Eli walked home together along the dirt path that cut through the trees. Neither spoke, but each felt a pull toward the other, a pull that came not from love or fate, but from blood quietly remembering itself. The midwife, known in the settlement only as Miss Ada, had lived longer than most could remember. Her skin was like parchment, creased with time and sorrow, and her eyes held the dim flicker of someone who had seen too much and spoken too little. She had been present at nearly every birth for the past 4 decades, carrying with her the burden of secrets too dangerous to repeat. When Martha and Eli began to appear together in the village, walking side by side through the misty trails or sitting in silence near the edge of the water, Miss Ada felt an unease stir within her that she could not ignore. Their faces mirrored one another in ways that went beyond coincidence. The shape of the jaw, the faint cleft in the chin, even the pale color of their eyes, all were echoes of something she had seen before, long ago, when she delivered 2 infants during a violent summer storm that nearly tore the settlement apart. Those children had been separated before the sun rose, each taken by different families after a death and a bargain no one dared to question. As she watched them together now, the memory gnawed at her like a persistent ache. The settlement had always kept its own rules, binding truth beneath the surface of necessity. It was not uncommon for records to vanish, for names to change, for stories to die before they could be told. But some sins left traces even silence couldn't hide. Miss Ada would sit outside her cabin at dusk, chewing on the end of a reed, watching the swamp swallow the day, and wonder if God had finally turned his eyes away from this forgotten patch of earth. She wanted to warn them, to tell them what she feared, but the words caught in her throat every time she tried. Speaking the truth here was not an act of courage, it was an invitation for the swamp to take notice, and everyone knew the swamp always took what it noticed. When Eli visited her for medicine one evening, she could hardly look at him. He spoke kindly, as he always did, but every word twisted the knife of recognition deeper. Later that night, she dreamed of the storm from years ago, the thunder that shook the roof, the 2 infants crying in unison, and the mother's voice begging her to keep them apart for their own sake. When she woke, the air felt thick and heavy, the cicadas silent as though the earth itself was listening. From that day on, Miss Ada avoided the young couple, though her eyes followed them wherever they went. She knew the past was crawling back to life, and that when it reached them, it would not come quietly. The day of the wedding came wrapped in a strange stillness that settled over the swamp like a shroud. The air was thick and unmoving, and the sky hung low with bruised clouds that promised rain. In the tiny wooden chapel at the edge of the settlement, the candles flickered weakly as if even the flames were reluctant to witness what was about to happen. Martha arrived in a simple white dress that looked more gray than pure in the dim light, her hands trembling as she clutched a bundle of wildflowers. Eli stood at the altar, his face unreadable, his jaw tight as though he sensed something waiting beyond the ceremony. The few townsfolk who dared to attend sat in uneasy silence, their eyes darting toward the windows whenever the wind groaned through the trees. There was no music, only the muffled sound of rain beginning to fall on the tin roof and the faint hum of insects outside. The preacher, an old man with shaking hands and a voice that cracked with every word, stumbled through the vows as though reading from memory rather than faith. When he reached the part about Holy Union, the chapel door creaked open and a gust of damp air swept through, extinguishing half the candles. A murmur rippled through the room, and for a moment no one moved. Eli reached out instinctively and took Martha's hand, steadying her as lightning flashed through the narrow windows, casting their faces in stark relief. In that moment, even the preacher hesitated. He saw in their features something uncanny, something too alike, and a tremor ran through his voice as he pronounced them husband and wife. Outside, the rain grew harder, pelting the ground in heavy sheets that turned the path to mud. The guests left quickly, some without a word, their faces pale and their steps hurried. Only Miss Ada lingered near the back, clutching her shawl, her lips pressed tight as if holding back a scream. She watched as the newlyweds walked down the steps, the storm breaking around them, the thunder rolling low across the swamp. Each flash of lightning seemed to follow them, illuminating their path as they disappeared into the trees. That night, as the rain continued without pause, the settlement was restless. Dogs howled without reason, and more than one person swore they saw figures moving between the cypress trunks, two silhouettes, hand in hand, swallowed by the mist. By morning, the storm had passed, but the air still carried the weight of something unspoken, something that had shifted beneath the surface of the swamp and would not settle again. Weeks after the wedding, the settlement seemed to return to its quiet rhythm, but an unease lingered like a stain that wouldn't wash away. The swamp had grown strangely restless, the frogs had gone silent, and the nights stretched longer than they should. It was during this uneasy calm that a wandering preacher arrived, a man who claimed to be passing through on his way to Baton Rouge. He was older, gaunt, and carried with him a worn leather satchel filled with Bibles and papers that smelled of mildew. The villagers were wary of strangers, but they allowed him to stay a night in the abandoned rectory near the edge of the clearing. That evening, as he unpacked his belongings, he discovered a small wooden chest hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The chest was damp with age, its brass hinges corroded and green, but when he pried it open, he found something that made his hands tremble, a stack of brittle ledgers bound with twine, each marked with a date and the name of the settlement, nearly 50 years old. By the light of a lantern, he turned the fragile pages. Inside were lists of births, deaths, and marriages written in careful script, though many of the names repeated, the same surnames circling back across generations like a loop with no escape. It was as though the settlement had been breeding within itself for decades, the same families marrying and dying without the world ever noticing. The preacher frowned as he read on, realizing that the bloodlines twisted so tightly that nearly every living person in the village shared the same ancestral thread. His hand stopped when he reached the entries from the summer of 1918. Two names caught his eye, twins born to the same mother during a thunderstorm, both recorded by a midwife named Ada L. Duval. One of the infants was listed as deceased, but the handwriting seemed rushed, the ink smudged as if written in haste. He felt an unease growing in his chest as he traced the lineage forward and recognized those same family names appearing again decades later, tied to the present generation. The preacher knew what such patterns meant. He had seen the consequences of isolation and secrecy in other forgotten corners of the South. That night, he brought the ledger to Miss Ada's door, but she refused to let him in. Through the crack, she whispered, "Put it back where you found it, before the swamp hears." Her voice trembled, not with fear of him but of what those names might awaken. He did as she asked, but sleep never came. Long after midnight, he stared out into the mist, the memory of those repeating names echoing in his mind like a curse, realizing that the past was not dead here, it was simply hiding, waiting for its turn to be born again. As the months passed after the wedding, Martha began to change in ways that frightened even those accustomed to hardship and mystery. Her skin grew pale and clammy despite the southern heat, and her eyes seemed to deepen with a strange, distant light, as if she were seeing things beyond the veil of the living world. The whispers started when her belly began to swell, not with joy but with unease. The women who gathered water at the creek would fall silent when she passed, watching her from the corners of their eyes. There was something unnatural about her pregnancy, something that seemed to drain the air around her. The animals reacted first, dogs barked at her door, chickens refused to lay near her house, and the swamp birds that once nested nearby vanished as if driven away by some unseen force. Eli tried to ignore the talk. He worked longer hours, chopping wood and patching the roof, pretending that all was well. But even he could not deny the strangeness in their home. Martha's appetite turned peculiar. She craved raw things, herbs that grew in the marsh, and she would sometimes stand outside at night, bare feet sinking into the wet soil, her head tilted toward the dark trees as though listening to something that called her name. Miss Ada, who had delivered every child in the settlement, refused to visit when she learned of the pregnancy. When Eli went to her cabin to beg for help, she would not open the door. Her voice from within trembled as she said, "The blood remembers, and what's remembered can't be undone." The old midwife's words haunted Eli. He began to suspect there was something more to their union, a secret that had been buried long before they met. Inside, the heat was unbearable, and the smell of iron hung in the air. Martha's eyes were wild, unfocused, her hair clinging to her face in wet strands. She whispered things between contractions, nonsense, or prayers, or perhaps names the doctor did not recognize. Eli held her hand until she bit down on her own arm to stifle a scream. When the moment came, the doctor's expression changed. His face went gray, his mouth tightening into a line of horror as he looked down at what emerged. He did not speak, did not even breathe for a moment, then muttered something about God's punishment before stumbling back. The child's first cry was unlike anything anyone had ever heard. It wasn't a wail but a low, rasping sound that made the window glass tremble. Eli stared at it, frozen, unable to understand what he saw. The baby was alive, but its limbs were twisted, its skin a pallid hue that seemed almost translucent under the lamplight. One of its eyes opened and reflected the light back like an animal's, and Eli fell to his knees. Martha reached out for it, her face breaking into something between awe and terror, whispering, "His still ours." The doctor could not bear to stay. He fled into the storm outside, stumbling through the mud, never returning to the settlement again. By morning, the midwife found the cabin door open, the lamp still burning, and a trail of blood leading to the cradle. The cries had stopped, but in the thick, humid silence that followed, the swamp began to stir as if something ancient had been awakened within it, something that would not sleep again. When daylight finally broke over the swamp, it brought no warmth, only a pale and uneasy light that bled through the fog like a dying flame. The midwife, Miss Ada, was the first to return to the cabin. She found Martha lying in bed, her face ghostly and still, clutching the child against her chest. Eli sat beside her, hollow-eyed, his hands stained with blood and dirt. Neither spoke. The doctor was gone, his bag left behind on the table, its contents scattered as if he had fled in panic. Miss Ada forced herself to step closer, though every instinct told her to turn back. When she saw the child, her breath caught in her throat. It was not the deformity alone that frightened her, it was the familiarity. The shape of the mouth, the curve of the brow, even the faint birthmark beneath the left eye mirrored something she had seen before, long ago, on another infant born during a storm just like this one. She whispered a name she had not spoken in decades, and Eli turned to her with a look that demanded answers. Unable to bear the weight of what she saw, Miss Ada sent for the preacher who had come weeks earlier, the only outsider who might still understand the ledgers he had discovered. When he arrived, he brought those brittle pages once more, though he carried them as if they were cursed. As he laid them on the table, the pieces began to fall into place. Line by line, name by name, he traced the tangled roots of the families that lived in the swamp. He read aloud the entry from 1918, the birth of twins to a woman named Clara Hensley, the same mother whose descendants now bore the names of both Martha and Eli. Miss Ada's hands shook as she realized the truth she had been too afraid to speak. The two young lovers were not strangers bound by fate but siblings separated as infants after a tragedy their families had hidden. Eli listened in silence, his expression collapsing under the weight of realization. The preacher's voice faltered when he reached the newer entries, those that showed the same bloodline looping endlessly back upon itself, generation after generation. The deformities, the strange illnesses, the whispered curses, all were the result of what had been buried for too long. Martha began to cry softly, clutching the child closer, her tears falling on its skin as if trying to wash away the sin of their lineage. Outside, thunder rolled again across the swamp though no storm had come, and the trees seemed to sway without wind. Miss Ada turned away, covering her mouth to keep from screaming, because the truth was not only unbearable, it was alive, written into the faces of those who had never known who they really were. In the days that followed the revelation, the settlement fell into a hush deeper than it had ever known. No one dared to speak of what had been discovered, but everyone felt it, an invisible heaviness that clung to the air, pressing against the skin like the swamp's own breath. The preacher was gone by dawn the next morning, leaving behind only his waterlogged Bible and the ledgers that no one dared to touch. Miss Ada kept to her cabin, her curtains drawn, her oil lamp burning through the nights as though afraid of what the dark might deliver. In the small cabin where Martha and Eli lived, the windows remained covered, and the sound of the baby's faint, rasping cries would drift through the trees at odd hours, sharp and thin as a blade. The people began to avoid that part of the swamp altogether, whispering prayers whenever they passed. Then, one night, the crying stopped. For the first time in weeks, silence wrapped around the swamp like a burial cloth. The next morning, when the neighbors gathered enough courage to look in on the couple, the cabin stood open, the door swinging gently in the breeze. Inside, everything was still. The table was set for two, though the food had gone cold. A small cradle stood in the corner, its sheets damp and smeared with something dark. Martha's wedding dress hung on the back of a chair, and Eli's boots were by the door, caked in mud that led out toward the trees. There were footprints, small and large, side by side, leading from the house into the cypress grove, ending where the swamp water began. No bodies were ever found, no trace of the couple or their child, only the faint impression of where someone might have stood too long in the mud, watching. By evening, the swamp had swallowed every sign of them. The wind carried the scent of decay, and the water rippled though nothing moved across its surface. Some said the couple had drowned themselves, offering their sin back to the land that had kept it hidden for so long. Others believed the swamp had taken them, reclaiming what never should have been born. Miss Ada, too weak to leave her bed, whispered that they had gone where all things return when the blood calls them home. After that night, no one spoke their names again. The cabin rotted and fell in on itself, the cradle sinking into the floorboards as vines crept through the cracks. And when storms swept across the bayou, people swore they could hear faint crying in the distance, sometimes like a child, sometimes like something older than the swamp itself. Decades passed, and the story of the vanished couple became less a memory and more a legend whispered by those who still dared to live near the edges of Vermilion Parish. The swamp reclaimed what remained of the cabin, swallowing its timbers into the wet earth until only a crooked chimney stood like a gravestone among the moss. Most who had witnessed those strange days were gone, their secrets buried beneath generations of silence. Yet the land itself never forgot. Hunters spoke of hearing soft murmurs at dawn, voices that drifted across the fog as though coming from beneath the water. Others claimed to have seen faint lights weaving between the trees on moonless nights, moving like lanterns carried by unseen hands. But what unsettled them most were the cries, thin, trembling sounds that would rise suddenly from the mist and fade just as quickly, leaving only the echo of something half human and half lost. In the early 1990s, a group of hikers wandered into the area, drawn by stories of ghost towns and forgotten cemeteries. They found no roads, only narrow paths winding between cypress trunks and stagnant pools that reflected nothing but grey sky. By the second night, one of them claimed to hear a child's laughter, soft and distant. The others dismissed it as the sound of wind through the reeds, until it came again, clearer, closer, and followed by the unmistakable rustle of footsteps in the water. When they found the ruins of the old chimney, one hiker noticed small handprints pressed into the damp mud nearby, though no footprints led to or from them. The group left before dawn, shaken and pale, each one swearing they would never return. Local folklore grew from those stories, twisting with each retelling. Some said the child had never died, that its parents had carried it into the swamp where it continued to live, neither growing older nor leaving the shadows. Others believed the land itself had absorbed their blood, giving the swamp its strange voice, its restless movement beneath still water. Even scientists who ventured there decades later reported strange readings, heat signatures where no life was visible, ripples in ponds untouched by wind. The old families of the parish refused to speak of it, their elders warning that the past had roots, and that some roots, once disturbed, will bleed. Now, on misty autumn nights, when the frogs fall silent and the moon hides behind clouds, Travelers claim they still hear the faint cry of a newborn drifting through the cypress. Some say it calls for its mother. Others say it calls for anyone foolish enough to answer.